In a world where people are often judged by their income title or uniform, some of the most powerful acts of humanity come from the least expected places. This story begins not in a boardroom or a mansion, but in the brightly lit corridors of a children's hospital, where healing doesn't just happen through medicine, but also through magic. Not the kind found in fairy tales, but the kind a single father carries around in a plastic bottle of bubbles. Meet Paul, a quiet janitor in his early 40s, with tired eyes and a warm smile. He's not the kind of man who draws attention when he walks into a room, but those who know him understand that his presence means something special. Paul has been working at the Children's Hospital for years, mopping floors, cleaning up spills, and sterilizing rooms. But behind his mop and gloves is a man whose greatest job title isn't janitor. It's father. He's been raising his daughter Chloe on his own since his wife passed away when Chloe was just 2 years old. And every moment since has been about keeping her world gentle, safe, and full of wonder now every day before work. Paul kisses Chloe goodbye, hands her her lunch, and heads into the hospital, not just to work, but to offer something extra, something beautiful in his pocket. He carries a small bottle of bubbles. It's not fancy. It doesn't cost much, but it's his secret weapon against fear and sadness. Because Paul has learned that when children are scared of needles, doctors, and strange machines, sometimes the best medicine is distraction, laughter, and light. He's known across the hospital as the Bubble Man, though few outside his department ever ask his name. And this brings us to a day that would change everything, a day that began like any other, but would ripple across the internet and touch millions. It was just past 8 a.m. when Paul walked into the pediatric emergency unit to clean the waiting area. He overheard a commotion in the trauma room. A child's cries filled the hall. Raw, high-pitched, terrified, a voice cried out, "I want mommy, please stop, it hurts." Paul paused outside the door. Heart heavy, he'd heard that kind of cry before. It wasn't just about pain, it was about fear and helplessness. It reminded him of the first time Chloe got stitches, how she clung to him and trembled. So Paul did what he always did in moments like this. He reached into his pocket, uncapped the bottle of bubbles, and walked in quietly. The room was full of tension. Doctors working, nurses focused. The little girl named Emma was thrashing. Terrified of the IV, the staff tried to calm her, but nothing worked. Then Paul knelt beside the bed, said, "Hey, Emma, want to see something cool?" And with one gentle puff, he sent a flurry of bubbles into the air, their soft shimmer catching the fluorescent light floating above Emma's face. And in that moment, her scream stopped. Her eyes widened. She reached for a bubble, then another, and soon the tears slowed. The panic faded, Emma's hand relaxed, and the nurse was finally able to insert the IV with no more struggle. The room shifted from panic to peace, and someone in the room pulled out their phone and recorded the moment, not for views or clicks, but because it felt like something sacred. A grown man in a janitor's uniform kneeling beside a hospital bed with nothing but kindness and bubbles, and it worked, and that video went viral within days. Not because it was flashy or shocking, but because it showed something we all crave to see: gentle compassion in action. The clip, titled "Janitor Blows Bubbles to Calm," Girl, hit 1 million views in 48 hours. Strangers shared stories of unsung heroes in hospitals everywhere. Parents left comments saying, "I wish someone like him was there for my child." And that moment began a conversation across the country, not about healthcare or budgets, but about emotional healing, the kind that comes from presence and play. And Paul had no idea any of this was happening. At first, he didn't even know he'd been recorded. He was just doing what felt right, what he'd done 100 times before. Because that's the thing about people like Paul. They don't act for recognition. They act from instinct, from heart. And this is where we pause and reflect. Because this story, while heartwarming, speaks to a larger truth across the world. There are thousands of Pauls in schools, shelters, nursing homes, janitorial roles, cafeteria kitchens, people with enormous emotional intelligence and invisible capes who bring joy where systems have failed. And we often overlook them until a camera catches them in motion, but their value isn't new. It's just finally being seen. And Paul's story teaches us that healing isn't just about the technical work, it's about connection too. Studies have shown that children who experience calm, compassionate care during trauma recover faster emotionally and physically. Pediatric therapists often emphasize the role of play in reducing stress, and Paul didn't need a degree to know that he just needed bubbles and empathy. And that kind of wisdom doesn't come from textbooks. It comes from love, especially the kind born from raising a child alone, from knowing how it feels to wipe away a tear without asking what's wrong, and understanding that presence matters more than explanation. That was Paul's real strength, his ability to be present with no agenda, no ego, just love in action. And Emma, the little girl he helped that day, would become more than just a moment in a viral video. Her parents would later reach out, not just to say thank you, but to learn from him, because they realized in that one act Paul had taught them something essential about calming fear. Not through force, but through play, through wonder. And as Emma's mother put it, he reminded me that the world isn't divided by uniforms. It's divided by those who show up with heart and those who don't. And from there, Paul's life would begin to change. But more importantly, the way others viewed janitors, caretakers, and everyday heroes would begin to change too. After that day when the video of Paul and the bubbles went viral, the hospital's phone lines buzzed nonstop. News crews wanted interviews, social media influencers shared the video with captions like, "Real hero in plain clothes," and even hospital staff, who had once overlooked Paul, now greeted him with newfound respect. But Paul, being who he was, didn't seek the spotlight. In fact, when asked for a comment, he simply said, "I'm just doing what any parent would do in that situation. I didn't do anything special, I just did what felt right." But the truth was, he had done something extraordinary, not because of the bubbles themselves, but because of the intent behind them. And let's explore that idea further. Why does something as simple as blowing bubbles feel so powerful in a high-stress situation? For children, play is more than entertainment. It's how they make sense of the world. Psychologists have studied this extensively and discovered that when a child is engaged in play, especially something visually soothing like bubbles, their brain shifts from a fear response to curiosity. This simple act reduces cortisol, lowers heart rate, and builds a sense of trust. And in Emma's case, that's exactly what happened. Paul offered something familiar and fun in an unfamiliar and scary place, and her nervous system responded with relief now. Emma's parents, who had once walked through the hospital hallways with quiet entitlement, became some of the most vocal supporters of emotional care in medical settings. They met with the hospital board, shared their story, and even donated funds to create what they called the Comfort Cart, a mobile station filled with toys, coloring books, stuffed animals, and of course, bubble kits for children undergoing procedures. The first one was named the Paul Cart. It was stationed outside the emergency unit, where his act of kindness had first unfolded. And what's beautiful about this story is how it inspired ripple effects, not just online, but in real life across hospitals and schools. People started creating their own versions of the Paul Cart. Nurses shared photos of their pediatric patients calming down with bubbles. Therapists wrote blog posts about using low-cost items to create emotional safety. And even college professors started using the video in lectures on the neuroscience of compassion. And meanwhile, Paul continued to work the night shift cleaning floors, taking out trash and occasionally stopping to comfort scared children. He always carried bubbles now, not just in his pocket, but in a small pouch with multiple bottles, each labeled with a child's name, because he'd started learning their preferences. Some liked glitter bubbles, others wanted bubble swords, and a few just liked the soft pop sound. He even created bubble games for children in recovery, encouraging them to blow bubbles and count how many landed on the nurse's hat or float to the window. And Chloe, his daughter, watched all of this with wide eyes. Not because she was surprised her dad was special, but because the world was finally seeing what she already knew. She even started making little notes and drawings for the kids at the hospital, attaching them to bubble bottles with messages like, "You are brave and you got this and this." Brings us to an important reflection. How often do we overlook the quiet acts of love because they don't come from a CEO or a celebrity? How often do we fail to see the wisdom of someone who wears scrubs without a stethoscope, or who works late nights, not in an office but on the hospital floor, where he kneels to clean up the spills no one else wants to touch? This story reminds us to look again, to pay attention to how people care, not just what they do for a paycheck, but how they show up emotionally, especially in roles we call invisible. And that is what makes Paul's journey so compelling. It wasn't just about one act, but about a pattern of presence, a habit of kindness, a daily discipline of noticing others in pain and offering comfort without waiting to be asked. And that kind of compassion builds real communities. Imagine if every workplace valued emotional intelligence the way they value credentials. Imagine if every school recognized the cafeteria worker who knows when a child skips lunch because they're sad, or if every hospital had a bubble man or woman to hold space for scared little souls. This isn't fantasy. It's possible. And Paul is proof. The hospital eventually offered him a new role, a family care assistant, which involved helping families transition during difficult procedures, offering emotional support, and being a liaison between clinical staff and pediatric patients. He was hesitant, at first unsure if he was qualified, but the staff insisted, reminding him that he was already doing the job. They were just giving him the title. And so he accepted it, not because he wanted a promotion, but because he knew it would let him do more of what he loved, being present for people when they needed it most. And here's where the real-life inspiration deepens, because across the country, other hospitals reached out asking for training tips for their staff, wanting to replicate the simplicity and success of what Paul had done. Some even flew him out to speak at conferences where he stood in front of doctors, therapists, and healthcare executives, telling them what he knew from the heart. Healing is not just about treatment, it's about trust, and trust begins with kindness. And through all of this, Paul stayed grounded. He still drove the same beat-up car, still lived in the same modest apartment, still packed Chloe's lunch every morning. But now when he walked through the hospital doors, people stood a little taller, smiled a little more, and children looked for the man with the bubbles because he reminded them that they mattered. And that's what children need most, not perfection, but presence, not performance, but attention. And through this movement of gentle care, Paul had helped change the culture of an entire hospital, from efficiency first to empathy first. And in that transition, lives were changed, children recovered faster, parents felt supported, and staff found new energy because compassion is contagious. And when it's modeled consistently, it rewires how people relate to one another. Paul's story had already touched millions through a single video and changed how many people viewed the simple idea of emotional care. But what happened next solidified his place, not just as a viral figure, but as a symbol of everyday heroism. One afternoon, months after he had accepted his new role, Paul was called to the ICU, not for a cleaning job, but for something much more delicate. A 6-year-old boy named Ezra was being prepped for heart surgery, and despite the presence of the best doctors, the child refused to calm down. Nurses had tried toys, cartoons, even his favorite snacks. But nothing worked. The surgeon, impatient and pressed for time, almost called for sedation. When one of the nurses remembered the bubble man within minutes, Paul walked into the ICU, his badge now reading Family Support Assistant, and as usual, he brought nothing but a pouch of bubbles and his calm spirit. He crouched beside Ezra and didn't say much. He just pulled out a small bottle, this one filled with star-shaped glitter, and whispered, "Hey, these are the kind that float longest. Want to see?" Ezra nodded slowly, and Paul began to blow soft, steady streams of shimmering bubbles that rose above the machines, floated past the IV stand, and danced near the overhead light. Ezra watched, his muscles relaxed, his breath slowed, and when the nurse inserted the IV, he barely flinched. The surgery went forward and was a success. Later, Ezra's parents approached Paul with tears in their eyes and asked, "How did you do that?" Paul shrugged and said, "Kids just need to feel safe. Sometimes magic is believing someone cares enough to show up." And that moment was more than just another win. It became a case study for the hospital's pediatric department. Soon, medical schools began incorporating emotional regulation and play therapy modules based on Paul's methods. They called it relational comfort interventions, using his techniques of attentiveness, playfulness, and presence to guide care for frightened children. And all of this came from a man without formal medical training, without a psychology degree, without letters behind his name. And this is where we must pause to reflect, because our society often celebrates credentials and certifications, but forgets that true wisdom and impact come in many forms. Yes, education matters, but so does lived experience. So does instinct, so does heart. And Paul had all three woven into every interaction. And while all of this was unfolding, Chloe was watching, not from the sidelines, but as an active part of her father's journey. She began creating a children's book titled The Bubble Guardian, inspired by her dad. The story featured a janitor who carried magical bubbles to hospitals and helped kids find courage during their darkest days. It was illustrated with crayons, markers, and love. And when she finished it, her teacher helped her enter a national youth author contest. And she won. The book was published, and copies were donated to hospitals across the country with Paul's blessing. And in one of life's full circle moments, Chloe got to read her story aloud at a hospital conference where her dad was being honored with a Community Compassion Award. And as she stood on stage reading her words to a crowd of doctors, nurses, and families, she looked at Paul and said, "I wrote this so kids know that heroes wear many uniforms. Sometimes it's not a cape, but a name tag and a smile." And the applause was thunderous. Not because she was eloquent, but because she was right. And this highlights something so critical that we must all remember. Every act of kindness plants a seed, and that seed can grow into books, programs, movements, and most importantly, healing. And Paul's seeds were now blooming across continents. Hospitals in Canada, Australia, and South Africa adopted similar comfort care policies, citing his approach. Schools added bubble breaks for kids with anxiety. Therapists taught children to use bubbles for deep breathing exercises. And Chloe, now a young teen, began hosting art workshops at the hospital where kids painted bubble scenes and wrote stories of bravery using their own experiences as fuel. And Paul continued to show up day after day, sometimes as a bubble man, sometimes just as a listener, because the truth is, we don't always need to speak to be present. And when a parent sobbed in the hallway, Paul would sit beside them in silence when a child stared out the window. Scared of the night, he would place a small glowing bubble lamp by their bed and whisper softly, "You're not alone." And that level of intuitive care was transformative. It reminded people that medicine can heal the body, but love heals the heart. And Paul became not just a part of the hospital culture, but its soul. New staff were trained not only in procedures, but in Paul's philosophy: see the person first, then the patient, and in doing so, healing became more human, less sterile. And even families who once felt disconnected began to participate more in care, playing with their children, blowing bubbles, singing lullabies, and trusting again. Because trust isn't built in meetings or policies, it's built one gentle moment at a time. And as Paul's story spread, celebrities reached out with praise, media outlets requested interviews, and a famous talk show even flew him and Chloe out for a surprise segment where they met other everyday heroes. And while Paul appreciated the love, he never let it change him. When asked what he would do with all this attention, he simply said, "I just want to keep showing up. That's the job, that's the gift, and that's the truth." Two, we don't have to change the world overnight. We just need to change someone's world one moment at a time. As Paul's story reached more corners of the world, the impact extended far beyond hospital walls. He had unintentionally started a quiet revolution in the way we understand care, not just in medicine, but in daily life. Parents, teachers, counselors, and even corporate leaders began to ask a powerful question: what if kindness was a core part of every job? What if emotional intelligence was treated with the same urgency as technical skill? What would happen if every environment encouraged us to notice one another, to pause and offer comfort? And that conversation gave birth to something even bigger, inspired by Chloe's book. And the viral bubble moment, a nonprofit organization called Light Touch was launched. Its mission was simple: to train and equip people in overlooked roles: janitors, cafeteria workers, bus drivers, security guards, with emotional care tools and resources so they could bring small acts of healing to those they served across hospitals, schools, shelters, and community centers. The first training modules included sessions on trauma, informed interaction, active listening, bubble therapy, play-based calming techniques, and building safe spaces without judgment. Paul served as an advisor, helping shape the tone and purpose of each lesson. And soon, Light Touch volunteers were being deployed everywhere. One janitor in a Detroit elementary school used bubbles to help a student with autism regulate after loud fire drills. A bus driver in Oregon handed out bubble tubes to nervous kindergartners on their first day, and a shelter worker in the Bronx introduced nightly bubble routines for children who had trouble sleeping, citing Paul's method as the inspiration in all of this, from a man who once thought no one even noticed his work. And this is where the real emotional core of the story deepens. Because Paul never did it for recognition, he did it because he knew pain. He knew what it felt like to be alone, to feel small, to be in a space where you didn't belong. When his wife passed away suddenly from illness, he was left with a newborn Chloe and no support system. He had to leave college, put aside dreams and take the first job he could find, and he chose the janitorial route. Not because it was his passion, but because it paid just enough to survive. And that survival turned into strength over time. As he bonded with Chloe during long walks in the park, nightly story times, and Sunday bubble-blowing contests, the bubbles had started as a way to keep her entertained when she cried. But slowly they became a tool for joy, then comfort, and eventually healing. And Paul carried that with him into every room he entered. Now the world had caught up to the quiet power of his approach, and Chloe, she blossomed under the light of her father's integrity. Now in high school, she started a teen club called Bubble Buddies, aimed at helping younger kids navigate emotional stress through creative outlets. She brought her dad's lessons into every activity, from journaling to group storytelling to acts of kindness challenges, and her peers responded not just with participation, but with passion because they saw something different in Chloe. She was grounded, empathetic, and radiant, and it all came from growing up in the presence of someone who never let struggle turn into bitterness, but instead transformed pain into purpose. And that's the lesson we all must hold on to. Trauma may visit, but it doesn't have to unpack, and stay. Brokenness may touch our lives, but healing is always possible, especially when we lean into compassion. Paul's journey is proof that small gestures ripple farther than we imagine, and that legacy isn't built in wealth or awards, but in the number of people who say, "I felt seen because of you." And there were many. Paul continued his daily rounds at the hospital, but now children ran to greet him, parents stopped to share updates, former patients sent postcards, and staff invited him to morning huddles to share motivational stories. One nurse even said to him, "You're the glue, Paul, when everything feels tense. Your presence reminds us why we do this work." And those words stuck with him, not because he needed validation, but because he believed in the mission of presence. It wasn't about fixing, it was about showing up again and again and again. And perhaps the most beautiful part was that Paul never let the recognition distort his humility. When asked by a major news anchor what he wanted his legacy to be, he replied, "I hope people remember that I used what I had, which wasn't much, just time, a listening ear, and a bottle of bubbles. And that was more than enough." And that idea, using what you have, has now become a global call to action. People everywhere sharing what little they can in service of others. And that is how real movements begin, not with noise, but with sincerity, not with strategy, but with softness. And Paul's softness changed the world. The power of Paul's journey wasn't just in the single moment captured on camera, it was in the continuity of compassion, the commitment to kindness that transcended time, location, and circumstance. And as the years passed, his story didn't fade. It deepened. Paul became a fixture in discussions about emotional care in everyday life. Not as a motivational speaker, not as a celebrity, but as an example, a reference point for what humanity can look like when it's quiet, humble, and persistent. Even when cameras moved on and headlines changed, Paul continued to do what he always had: show up for people. He stayed at the hospital, even as higher paying offers came his way, even when foundations wanted to hire him as an ambassador, because he believed that the work he did every day, cleaning rooms, offering comfort, walking alongside scared parents and anxious children, was not only honorable, it was essential. And in doing so, Paul redefined success in a world obsessed with status. He became a mirror reflecting the truth that real success is impact, that real wealth is the number of people who feel less alone because of you. And this lesson became the cornerstone of Chloe's graduation speech when she completed high school with honors, standing at the podium. She looked out at her classmates and said, "Most people think a hero has to save the world. But sometimes saving one moment, one person, one tear is enough. My father taught me that," and everyone in the audience stood because they knew that wasn't just sentiment, it was legacy. Chloe carried that legacy with her as she started college, choosing to study pediatric psychology with an emphasis on trauma recovery. She wanted to combine the science of healing with the soul of it, and Paul supported her every step of the way, driving her to campus, helping set up her dorm, and giving her a brand new bottle of bubbles with a note that read, If you ever feel overwhelmed, just remember what helped others can help you too. And that simple message was a distillation of everything Paul believed in. That comfort and courage aren't opposites, they're companions. And in that truth, Chloe thrived. She began to host seminars on play therapy, volunteered at children's clinics, and even started a research project exploring the link between sensory play and emotional resilience, all inspired by the lessons she had absorbed growing up. Not from textbooks, but from watching her dad work with dignity and warmth. And back at the hospital, Paul was now training new recruits, sharing his approach not as doctrine, but as invitation. He encouraged every staff member to find their own bubble. Whatever that may be, a smile, a song, a gesture that brought ease. And in doing so, he helped build a culture where patients were not just healed, but held. And this culture began to spread to other sectors. Corporations invited Paul to share his insights on leadership through compassion. Schools hosted Paul Days, where students learned the importance of empathy through interactive activities, and hospitals across the globe added bubble kits and emotional first aid modules to their pediatric units. And yet, despite all this, Paul never let the outside noise interfere with his internal compass. He still lived in the same neighborhood, still grew tomatoes in his backyard, still read Chloe's old bedtime books to children in waiting rooms, and it's in these quiet moments that his true impact is revealed. Paul didn't need a spotlight to shine. His light was steady, consistent, and unwavering. And now we arrive at the core of this story, the part where the takeaway becomes crystal clear. The lesson Paul leaves behind is not complicated, it is not revolutionary in the traditional sense, but it is transformative. The lesson is this: we all have bubbles to give. They may not be literal, they may not be flashy, but they matter. Your smile might be someone's moment of peace. Your patience might be someone's lifeline. Your gentle presence might be the reason someone doesn't give up. And when we embrace this truth, we stop looking for permission to make a difference, and we start being the difference. And if there's anything we should carry from Paul's journey, it's this: your job title doesn't define your worth. Your income doesn't determine your impact, and your background doesn't limit your potential. What matters is how you love, how you show up, how you respond when someone is hurting, and that is something we can all do right now wherever we are. And so Paul's story ends not with a dramatic twist, but with quiet, ongoing change, the kind that continues in small homes and crowded hospitals, in classrooms and on buses in neighborhoods, and in hearts. And his legacy is not a statue or a building named after him, but a world slightly kinder because he was in it. And for Chloe and for every child he ever comforted, and for every parent who breathed easier because of him, Paul will always be the man with the bubbles, the one who reminded us all that healing is not a profession, it's a choice.